welcome you all to this AI Impact Summit, pre-summit event that is this collaborative session between Athena Infonomics, Dev-Afrique, DevGlobal and Development Gateway for this dialogue on DPI and AI advisory systems. Just a couple of super quick housekeeping notes on the top. As you may have noticed already, this is being recorded. And we will also be taking some screenshots over the course of the session, which is as part of kind of the AI Impact Summit participation, so you are certainly invited and encouraged to be on camera. Of course, if there's bandwidth considerations, we understand those. So without further ado, let's jump in to the heart of this. And before I get to kind of the exact agenda, I just want to kind of take a moment to set the stage on why are we having this conversation. So, ultimately the objective of this session, of this dialogue, is really to explore this journey from kind of data foundations to solutions that can meaningfully scale, at population level and enable real impact and benefit to the kind of target recipients of those tools and solutions. And at the base of that journey, of that process, is having robust data foundations, right? And when designing AI models, the data quality, what you're putting in, and I know this group knows that, and we're really excited about this group. And this has been an invite-only event of curated individuals that are working actively on these questions and challenges. And so, right, this isn't a rocket science kind of visual here. I think we're all familiar with this, right? But if you have bad data, that feeds into flawed analysis, and that leads to poor decisions. When you add AI into the equation and you have bad data going into your models, that's just an amplifying and multiplying effect of what those flawed decisions can look like, and how that can kind of manifest in the lives of the people that these tools and solutions are trying to benefit. So AI doesn't generally fix bad data, it amplifies it. So what does that mean for making data usable in real systems? The digitalization process and journey enables access, but it doesn't necessarily ensure usefulness in and of itself. Right? We are all, I think, in this group, familiar with digital transformation journeys that have stalled or stagnated or just proven ineffective because of maybe short-sighted or poor design choices in how that transition was executed, or failure to consider the full contextual realities. So usefulness requires a level of reliability, interoperability, and that in turn leads to trust and shared understanding across all of the stakeholder groups and that are interacting with and utilizing these systems and leveraging these systems for their decision making. And most governments are operating with legacy systems, right? We're not coming into greenfield environments for the most part, where we're building off of what's there, and we're trying to advance those existing tools and infrastructure in a way that lends itself to sustainable and scalable impact and outcomes. Fundamentally, many failures, again, I think we've all seen this, are not necessarily technical failures. They're failures to work honestly and within existing systems and really approach the problems in a way that's contextualized or tailored to the existing kind of political, economic, and political economy of digital transformation, let's say, that existing context. So where do we go from there? How do we get to solutions at scale? Use cases have to fit real needs, and they have to align with ecosystem readiness, right? So we have to be very intentional and practical in our diagnostic steps of what are we choosing to even test and pilot. How have we made that choice? Why are we making that choice? And what does that journey, that testing process look like, to ensure that we're mapping up not just to user needs, but the realities of kind of that operating ecosystem. And I'm excited for Deepa to share some of the work that that we are actively doing on that front in Andhra Pradesh, for example. Well-designed sandboxing, experimentation, and learning allow for these investment decisions on kind of AI advancement to be well-targeted and well-suited to the environments in which you're trying to scale. And then by working with policymakers and being intentional in the way you try to shape policy alignment with kind of incentives and institutions and governance, you can really help further enable and drive forward these scaling efforts. So this session is looking to kind of bring some texture to that kind of journey. And we're going to do that. These are the opening remarks. We're almost at the conclusion of that first phase, and we'll be jumping into these case snapshots on sectoral applications in DPI and AI. And these snapshots are going to share, different practical journeys, experiences on these kind of this data foundation to scalable solution journey, and really help bring some texture to the conversation. And we really want this to be a conversation. And the final, hopefully, half of this session, like the last hour, is really going to be dedicated to an open dialogue with this group of curated participants to share and learn from each other. And so I really want to highlight these objectives here, right? A highly participatory exchange on applied learnings and experiences on DPI and AI-enabled advisory. Surfacing some cross-sector through lines. We are going to talk a lot about kind of agriculture and livestock. We have some examples in the water sector that we'll talk about as well. And then I know the participants in this room come from a variety of sectoral experiences and applications. So let's surface these, cross-sector through lines in advancing DPI and AI. And how can these through lines inform and strengthen future efforts to advance, or to invest in DPI and AI. And then what are some current challenges that are facing us as practitioners, as policymakers, as funders, and what are some concrete opportunities amongst the individuals in this session to collaborate and help kind of solve those challenges together? So without, again, I just want to express my thanks and excitement about kind of everyone that's joined us today. I think it's a really great group. While we're not going to go around and do introductions, I would invite you all to put in the chat, assuming you have that capability, kind of your name and where you're coming from. And then I'll hand it over now to Beverly, who's going to take us through our first use case snapshot, or applied snapshot here. So Beverly.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear and see me okay. We'll try to keep this light, get into the weeds a bit, but also try to enjoy it. It can be hard with webinars when you're online. So I'll do my best to keep it a little bit dynamic. So I'll dive in today on some work we've been doing at Development Gateway around building and further strengthening Ethiopia's livestock livestock data ecosystem. But the big thing is talking about how we go from here to there, how we start with legacy systems like livestock data systems, for example, and how we jump to the next level or two with DPI and AI. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the project. It's called Alive, Livestock Vision for Ethiopia. And the basic gist of it, it's really about how do we make sure that data across multiple systems is connected and arriving in decision makers' hands at the right time to leverage evidence for better decision making. Ethiopia is one of many countries that has an ambitious plan for driving agricultural productivity, in particular livestock growth, and how can data help drive that evolution or that revolution. But today, so that's the broader program. We're working with 5 systems, making them interoperable, but I'll dig into the weeds a little bit about how do we get there. Part of what I want to frame is that how do we prep so much of the existing systems that we know are there in water, in agriculture, in health for the next step? We are still in a climate that I don't think is changing more broadly around constrained financial decisions at national level, at global level. And the word of the day or the framework of the day is going to be how do we optimize what we have, knowing that we've got emerging technologies coming forward. So there are several aspects to the program, but I'll focus on data interoperability through standards, governance, standards, governance, and sort of the technical interoperability to zero in. Next slide, please. Before we can really get to DPI, what data and systems need to feed into that layer? I'm going to run with a metaphor. You may love it, you may hate it. Hopefully you love it. We have 5 cupcakes that don't talk to each other and they're not even sitting in the same box, but we need to get to a wedding cake. We want a multi-layered cake at the end of the day in which the legacy systems and the DPI layer of ID and payments and AI are well integrated. Cupcakes are so last year, slow 2025 or 2024. We need something much more dynamic, but how do we help, in particular, the public sector go from cupcake to wedding cake? So this slide is a little bit of what we're talking about here. Again, we're using Ethiopia and its livestock subsector as an example, but they have 5 systems that regularly cover about 90% of the data-driven decision use cases. Those 5 systems, it might be a bit hard to see. One system covers identification, another covers vaccinations, yet another covers the market value or is used by the Trade Department for trade, and another covers animal disease. All of these things are mission critical to understanding the life cycle of cattle if we want to go from birth to export, which is where a farmer can make their money. But it's very difficult to know where are the breaks in the chain. How do we bring these together so that we know we can truly follow an animal through its life cycle, not just for the eventual export and the gains that come from that, but even in the meantime, managing animal disease, for example. As we've been through the COVID pandemic globally, we know well that disease can move from animals to humans. So it's not only good for the animal and good for the farmer, it's good for everybody if these systems are speaking to each other regularly to create a clear picture. Next slide, please. So that previous slide, what I should have mentioned is that what we see so far is that the discussion around DPI often talks about the layer, but it is disconnected from those legacy systems or that legacy digital transformation that already exists. What we want to do is connect those layers and bring them together so that they are stacked on top of each other and integrated. How do we do that? Again, coming back to our wedding cake, is we really want a holistically integrated technical stack in the full sense of the word, that the data is harmonized, the systems are harmonized, so that the value chain and the future planning can be as well. The first step with that is starting with standards, which I should have highlighted a bit in the last slide, but is still relevant here. Organizing the data. The best example, micro example I can use is that multiple systems of the 5 that we've been working with when we started had a different format for animal identification. Some systems used a 5-digit number, some systems used 6. We couldn't tell, and neither could the system owner sometimes, if we were talking about the same animal or different animals, simply because the identification numbers weren't consistent across systems. So when we talk about setting data standards as a really critical, this is a concrete place you can start, it really matters, because if you want to be able to easily make connections to human identification or human payment systems, you've got to have that consistency around your collateral or around your animal. So setting a data standard up front is a really key piece of getting legacy systems future ready, and that the data that they contain is formatted well enough that it can be integrated. Nothing is seamless, right, in digital transformation, but at least make it a bit easier. Once you have that data standard piece in place, it's making sure that your technical interoperability, so your API connections, your data lakes, those other kinds of structures are coupled with almost a human level of interoperability. And that's why your data governance protocols are important. What we found with the 5 systems that is also a critical building block for making legacy systems DPI ready and therefore AI ready is that they don't need to have, while individual systems have some quirks, animal disease in Ethiopia, for example, is quite sensitive at times. That can be a PR nightmare if not well managed. So certain indicators around disease are very carefully managed by the government, and therefore there are extra layers of security and privacy before that data can be released. An animal identification number, not the same level. So there are some differentiated needs, but by and large, what facilitates the kind of seamless data sharing that doesn't drag people back to developing an MOU or a special agreement every single time they need to share data is setting and framing a data governance protocol or sharing across multiple systems that is adaptable to individual system needs, but establishes a minimum level of engagement for everybody. So we've built out data governance framework and protocols across the 5 systems that are shared, with some tailoring for the individual systems, as I'd mentioned, with the idea that while this works for the livestock sector, it's very much scalable and adaptable and usable. The North Star around data governance here, especially if we're talking about investments in DPI and AI, is that eventually these kinds of frameworks need to be ministry-wide or sector-wide. The more we can reduce the friction in sharing key information across systems, the more consistently and with quality you can feed into AI tools that come in the future that are going to need to rely on that consistent pipeline of strong data across multiple indicators. So to bring it back, that interoperability needs to have both the human and the technology angle. You need the API integrations where you can get them, or the development of data lake or other kinds of warehousing database to help centralize that pool of key information. But you also need the human element, knowing that the humans can interrupt that technological structure if the right kinds of clarity around sharing and engaging aren't in place. Last thing I'll say on this is that from a systems perspective, that interoperability also offers real benefits down the line, especially when we're talking about DPI and AI. Data quality, what we found is with system owners and system producers, the individual system owners, when they could more quickly see the results that don't make sense, or where the gaps are between what they were targeting with some of their strategy targets versus the actual data, it allowed them to fix things in real time. So it wasn't just theoretically, oh, data quality is important. It was, oh, we can see now in real time why this is a problem, why this quality issue is a problem, which helps bring the quality gap into the light and provide a little bit more motivation to fix it and to fix it regularly. Having a level of centralization is also critical for data security. If we can reduce the individual security vulnerabilities that often happen with individual systems, that's a win for everybody. One of the examples I've also used in the past around why the human element is important is that one of the biggest issues we had with one of the 5 systems and keeping them connected was that it kept going offline Friday night to Monday morning, and we couldn't figure out what the problem was. It turned out a cleaner was accidentally unplugging the server. And these are the kinds of things that, aren't as sexy to fix, but they're important to highlight because so much about being able to encourage decision makers to use data and use data regularly is about consistency. The data needs to be there online when they're looking for it at the time that they're looking for it, because you only have so many chances, especially for high-level decision makers, your policy leaders in ministry elsewhere, to go to the dashboard or go to the website and not find what they're looking for before they decide that that tool isn't giving them what they need. So
yes, just a 2-minute warning.
2-minute warning, excellent. Okay. Good, because I only have one more slide after this.
Okay.
So this is important. So when we're talking about building trust through technical and human interoperability, this matters again when we're thinking about DPI. We know to some extent that DPI is loaded. There are a lot of loaded opinions and feelings around identification, around payment systems, wanting to minimize exploitation and support integration that really matters for citizens. Part of how we can make small moves, especially from legacy systems, is to support consistency, making sure that the systems are online when they're supposed to be, that they have the right technical infrastructure behind them and the right humans in front of them to keep that data flow coming, so that as those flows feed upwards through the wedding cake layer into DPI integrations, into AI integrations, it delivers that levels of consistency, both for policymakers and for citizens, that people are going to be looking for. Next slide, and the last slide. So I've gotten into this a little bit already. As you can see, I've noted that improving trust in government is mission critical for DPI and also for the climate that we're operating in. But here we are. This is the North Star of where we want to be in the wedding cake era. When we talk about the value of DPI, we want to be able to point to where and how quickly it really has an impact on citizens. We're in a phase with DPI implementation where people are really looking to say, okay, where is the value add, and how can I feel it, and how can I see it? And it's going to be mission critical that we connect those to use cases in water, in agriculture, in other areas. When we can, and I used this term earlier, when we can reduce the friction, especially between data and systems that feed upwards into the wedding cake, there's so much more that gets unlocked. We can boost trade and market access. If countries can reliably trace the vaccination record of their livestock, that is one of the most important factors that dictates whether they're able to export some of their products successfully. Some markets, the European market, the Australian market, the Chinese market, all expect clear and and traceable records of vaccination. And when you have fragmented systems, you can't do that. Knowing that product marketability is a big goal for many countries, especially to boost the basic income of farmers. How can we use AI and DPI to speed that up, to target subsidies, or to target other kinds of strategic economic boosts that drive that kind of productivity? It starts with the cupcakes, but becomes a cake. And this is why that investment, the governance, the standards, and that technical and human interoperability are a crucial piece of preparing those legacy systems to do some of those bigger picture things. I've mentioned, or I think I can actually stop there.
Yeah.
So I've mentioned a lot of these other things already, but hopefully if we get a chance to discuss during the question and answer, happy to go into that in a bit more detail.
Yeah, and so what we can do like 1 or 2 quick questions now, and just to kind of start getting some thinking generated. And we really do want this to be conversational and interactive. I know this will start with some of this context setting and texture and foundation setting for the conversation. But any one or two quick questions for Bev, and then we'll obviously have an extended dialogue in the second half of this session.
So Beverly, one question from my side. So are you expecting that a lot of this content is governed centrally by somebody?
That's a great question. I think it is very context specific by sector and by country. In Ethiopia, where a centralized model makes sense and also is in keeping with how the government administration is run, it makes sense because at the moment it's too fragmented often for us to be able to sustain some of the data sharing structures we put in at project level. Not always appropriate. A decentralized or federated model can make a lot more sense in a lot of other countries, but I think we have to be able to ask that question and answer it. What's the best model that will reduce friction?
One Jiku, please.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, Shrikant, did you have any follow-up there?
No.
Okay, one Jiku,
I'm
please,
good.
and then one Jiku will be the last here, and then we'll hand it over to the next session.
Thanks, Bev, for that wonderful presentation. I'm just wondering, since you started this work before AI really came to fore in Africa, assuming you have this governance structure, the standards already set up, and you have a system, and then suddenly now AI comes into play, and you have policies that are developed within the government, how much more effort would you have to put in order to then go back and ensure that the system is fully updated in order to take into consideration the AI principles?
Yeah, I think that's a great question that really highlights one of the challenges and opportunities of this moment is that although AI is new, a lot of the principles that are underlying it and should underlying it are on a continuum from broader digital transformation. So when we started the program, we're closing in on 4 years. We knew that new tools would be coming. Maybe it's AI, maybe it's predictive analytics. There are many others, maybe it's Earth observation data. There are so many others, things that we can't see yet. So how do we build with concreteness, but flexibility at the same time? So a lot of our thinking with our technical team about how we structured the data lake was that we don't know the ways in which this data could be used in future, but based on the standards we have, is the cybersecurity rigorous enough? B, does it have structures built in that if Ethiopia, for example, wants to get to a point where they're exporting 1 million animals a year, and they're at maybe less than a third of that number now. The number of data points from between a third of that and 1 million is massive. Can we build a lake that will continue to expand as that rapidly growing data pool grows? So that we might not have said this is an AI ready data lake structure, but we built with scale in mind. And I think that's some of the kind of thinking and framing that can help us both respond in an innovative way to tools like AI that are coming in, but it won't be the first and it won't be the last innovative technology. So how can we build with scale in mind? So I hope that kind of answers it. Of course, there will be some pivoting to be done, but I think it's about framing early and often that we've learned quite a lot about digital transformation, especially through digital systems, and how can we keep harnessing that with scale in mind.
That's awesome. Thank you. And great question, Wanjiku and Shrikant. All right, I'm going to hand it, Deepa, you wanna take control of the screen sharing, yes? Okay. So I'm handing it over. Thank you very much, Beverly, for a really informative presentation, and looking forward to kind of picking up on some of these conversation themes in about 40 minutes.
Awesome. I absolutely love the cupcake sort of wedding cake analogy, Bev, and it's easier to make cupcakes, right? And cupcakes don't go to wedding cakes because the level of skill required to make cupcakes is significantly different. And I was like, Mike's going to kill me if I was like a speaker and I also asked a question. So, but I want to leave a prompt that I'd love for us to come back and talk about, because I also know there's some incredible experience and expertise in the group that's here today, which is how do you, because one of the arguments that's been made is vendor lock-ins and avoiding vendor lock-ins, which I think is a very valid one. But when you don't necessarily have the capacity to bake a wedding cake, you then have a system integrator lock-in, right? So what in practice can be done, and what does that mean, particularly as governments are evolving their own capacities to think about digital transformations? That's going to be an exciting thing to talk about, but love the analogy. The angle from where I'll sort of present a little bit today is just really building off of the work and the experience, particularly over the last year, that my colleagues and I have had in terms of trying to think about that question that you see here on my cover page. And we've thought about this question now in three sort of very different contexts. The first is in the context of agriculture. This is for the state government of Andhra Pradesh. It's a program that we're just about 8 weeks into, supported by the Gates Foundation, where the focus is thinking about AI and AI advisory tools and frontier technologies and how that can enhance farmer incomes, which is the North Star there. We're also working with the government of India, the India AI mission, to think about the question of AI and AI use in the context of factory floors in manufacturing. And the sector that I've spent now over a decade on, which is water, thinking about working with water utilities, starting with Africa, on what does it mean to drive practical and sort of responsible adoption of AI within water utilities. Now, while these sectors are quite different, in talking to water utilities, in talking with departments and government departments in the state of Andhra Pradesh, and also several factories, there are some really interesting cross-cutting threads that emerge. The first is almost everything that these stakeholders today know, or these users know, comes from technology service providers trying to sell solutions about artificial intelligence. So it's a bit of a situation of hammers looking for nails, which is how markets evolve. So that's natural. But what that creates is an environment where it's sort of a little bit of a buyer beware situation, right? Because there isn't the same level of capacity, knowledge. There are clear information asymmetries today, both within the private sector and the public sector, as they're engaging with technology service providers. There aren't enough concrete examples of what has worked at scale. There are clear data security concerns. I mean, the constant question is, so who owns the data and what happens to my data, right? Like, what are some model risks as we go into this? What do we know about how the model does what it does? And what are some risks that could potentially be business sensitive if you are a factory floor adopting it, or for governments, what are some risks, for example, in terms of ethics and inclusion that they need to be aware of? And these are questions top of mind across users. And the biggest piece is one of also just a sense of self-efficacy, right? How do you go from here to there? What does step 0, step 1, step 2, step 3 look like? Now, I'll share a little bit about some of our early thinking on this so far in terms of how we're starting to think about our role as a technical service provider in these different contexts and some of the cross-cutting elements across the work that we're doing. The first piece, quite intuitively, starts with where is their value, right? What is the problem that we're solving for, or the opportunity that we're unlocking? And if it's governments, governments need a clear cost benefit, right? There's an economic return that they need to see on their investments and a social return that they need to see on their investments, while for the private sector, it becomes an ROI estimation. And thinking about questions of institutional and technology architectures to sort of really drive population scale adoption becomes a very crucial piece to get right at the front. And thinking through those elements and then saying, okay, these could potentially be some really mature use cases for us to consider is where we'd start. Once we've shortlisted a set of use cases that seem compelling, I think you go on to then saying, what are the data requirements and digital and instrumentation infrastructure that's required? And what's fascinating here is that the technology frontier is shifting very, very rapidly. Just 3 months ago, some of our assumptions about edge computing and devices in the context of manufacturing and what the costs and what the cost structures for that would look like are already obsolete based on the latest drop of NVIDIA's supercomputer chip called Yoda Edge. So what we're starting to see is that when we're starting to think about digital technology and instrumentation requirements, there is an active sort of almost scenario modeling where we're starting to tracking of how these cost curves and assumptions around technology is going to change and keeping that sort of a little bit live as we're thinking about also going back as a feedback loop into cost benefits. And then how do we start learning what exists out there? So what's fascinating about this journey for me and the learning curve that I've had since we started doing this work is we're starting with the users and the demand, and then getting to what are the technology solutions that exist that could be responsive to that demand today. And then actually help buyers or users of technology services to think critically about these different technology options. For example, just in cotton, there are half a dozen LLM agents that provide a range of advisory services or advisory agents on just cotton. Now, how do you decide which one to go with? Right? And this is where some of the work that we've done focuses on how do we build that sort of gold standard benchmark data set with the buyer, prepare the data layer, set up an evaluation design, and actually help them evaluate model performance, both in terms of language and their performance with respect to the language, but also with in response to the technical context that you're applying that particular model in. And then we go on to saying, okay, here are the solutions that could be the best fit. Here are the guardrails you need to consider. But from this point on, we go into sort of really a bit of a feedback loop, right? Which is, that's just where the journey starts in some sense, right? Because once you've said, okay, I'm going to use this LLM agent, or I'm going to use this particular model, or I'm going to go with this particular service provider, that doesn't guarantee adoption. A ton of work needs to be done on the ground, in the field, through policy design and scheme and additional nudges, through systematically monitoring the processes within which these AI solutions are being integrated in to think about process integrity and performance. And this is sort of a constant feedback loop, right? On learning what's working, investing in change management, behavioral shifts, driving adoption, evaluating what is and isn't working, monitoring performance, and then thinking about nudges and technology upgrades in that context. In our experience already, policy and technology are the most powerful factors, right, to disrupt or shift behaviors at the field level. And those will sort of be the ones that get the most sort of focus as we're thinking about some of those nudges and incentives. Now, what I want to do is talk about what we're learning and sort of build back some of the connections to the thinking about digital public infrastructure from this lens of AI use and adoption, with a deep dive on the work that we're doing in Andhra Pradesh. A little bit additional context. In AP, the premise is that AI advisory and this fair amount of work that's been funded and done in different parts of the world, where RSKs in this context are extension workers in the state of AP. And the hypothesis is that AI advisory tools can really equip RSK workers to do more with less. And that's both quantitatively and qualitatively, because the state is rapidly urbanizing, labor is becoming harder to find, particularly in rural areas, to perform the job of extension worker tasks. So there is a bigger focus on unlocking productivity in the last mile. So can, for example, an extension worker today, instead of reaching 2,000 farmers actually reach 5,000 farmers? Can he or she also qualitatively provide much higher quality advice and support in terms of micro-planning and equipping farmers to actually expand incomes and improve yields? So those are the sorts of questions that we're actively exploring in the context of Andhra Pradesh. Here's a quick snapshot of what we're dealing with. And it's really, you have farmers, and the North Star for us is expanding farmer incomes to 50 lakhs INR per capita. This is for the state. This is a state vision. This is a very powerful vision that's articulated by the Honorable Chief Minister. And RSKs, we have about 8,000 RSKs or extension workers in the state that approximately, as I said, each RSK could serve anywhere between 1,500 to 2,000 farmers. We have more or less a baseline of about 9 to 10 million farmers that sort of form the population. This, of course, changes by season. But today, there is a lot of engagement and interaction between the RSK and the farmers in terms of generating data. And this data gets generated through a multitude of apps that an extension worker fills in, which you sort of see in this sort of big blue box above, which then feeds into a data corpus, right? That's managed and owned by a lot of different agencies. And I'll actually talk about that in slightly greater detail in a minute. And though the data that's being generated here is then used for policy and program design, it's used for a range of digital services that the government provides, but it's also used for monitoring the performance of extension workers so that they actually are able to make sure they're being resourced and they're essentially being held accountable to deliver actual value to farmers. And often these is on levers like insurance, credit, market linkages, and farm inputs. Those are the action levers where a lot of this activity now takes place. This is the context. Now, when we started thinking about this, one of our early mandates was, how can we leverage this data corpus that is being generated from a lot of these apps that these RSK workers are filling out to start thinking about an LLM agent that can provide high quality insights and intelligence that the RSKs can leverage. I'm going to illustrate with an example here on what would it take now in that context that I've just described as a baseline to build some sort of an advisory agent that can tap into that data corpus. We started with a very simple question, which was something that the government was very interested in learning, was what is the trend, right, of incomes coming from farm versus livestock for the last two sort of seasons, in some sense, the cropping seasons in a particular district of the state. Now, answering this question, we've had to access these 9 different data sets. These are just the apps that and the data that will come from these apps are the ones that we will need to tap into to go back and find the answer to that question. And this sits with owner, and the owners can range from NIC within government of AP, different departments within the government of Andhra Pradesh, private sector actors like Vasar Labs and Amnex Technologies, Government of India divisions such as the Department of Animal Husbandry and Dairying in Government of India, and the Department of Agriculture, Government of India. Now, in addition to sort of just the sheer complexity of navigating all of these different frontline apps to answer one question that we'd want to learn more about, because there is really a lot of data generation, but not enough data use or a culture of data use, the data quality is quite poor. In some of the early work, we can start saying, okay, you start seeing trends and you're saying, okay, these don't make sense, right? Like you could see something as erroneous as, okay, the total cultivable area in the state could be larger than the total land area. And so those are data quality considerations when there is just too many data systems that I don't think are being actively used. And a fair bit of redundancy. And a lot of you here are familiar with the story where the same data often is entered across multiple apps, adding to the burden of the frontline staff, but with very little value addition to farmers. Now, and this, by the way, is just 9 of the 20 plus systems that RSKs today fill information into in the state. So when I start thinking about a question like AI advisory or thinking about how we can unlock the power or the value of AI, I want to sort of
Just about
one of the things that
2 minute warning, Deepa. Just
thanks, I'll try. Okay, is to start thinking about what does I would almost say what is the AI plumbing in this context, right? And often the AI plumbing here is the operational workflows and the data infrastructure that you're building these AI models on. And I want to really highlight the emphasis here, because what we're seeing today is because there is a disconnect between really the data corpus and the value creation to RSK workers, and that feedback loop is missing. The quality of engagement between the extension workers and the farmers are not necessarily as high as it could be. Now, what this creates is weak data systems, and any AI model that's built on management practices or a data corpus that is generated through this process poses significant risks. The focus then here is not to start with the LLM agent right off the bat, but to focus on the process, to turn the sort of reds into the greens, right? And think about how to stabilize the process workflow, which is really going to be, and this is again, I think, the sort of vision of the leadership for the state, which I think is very inspiring, is to say, how do you build robust process workflows anchored on generating useful intelligence to RSKs? And this is not something we're going to get right off the bat. This is something that will go through multiple rounds of iterations to get right. And then think about how to test, prioritize, and add an AI layer on top of it. So when you think about this, the pieces here, and when we think about what it means to integrate AI in government systems and data corpuses or corpora that get generated within that, thinking about current and future workflows, what workflow is needed, how do you stabilize it, and really paying attention to monitoring the performance of the workflow, not just the outcomes, become really critical early on. And then thinking through how to digitize thoughtfully. So this is where the DPI piece becomes really interesting. And Mike and I'll probably get to that. Just one more slide, and then I can close. Is that even with like a perfect sort of a loop, obviously we're going to get better at thinking about data quality. It'll definitely create more conversations and opportunities, but without sort of intentional reworking of the data and digital architecture at the back end, I do think that the efficiencies aren't fully tapped into. And of course, finally, thinking about the relevant guardrails. This is where, I think this sort of focusing, going digital is a necessary but not sufficient condition. And how we digitalize government functions has a huge impact on who benefits or is left behind, what the scalability of AI adoption is. And if the aspiration, and if we're thinking critically about population scale get-go, we have to digitalize differently. And I think DPI is powerful. Right? And this doesn't mean you're doing something, this doesn't mean AP suddenly abandons everything that it's done, all of the infrastructure that they built up to do something completely different. And like Bev quite beautifully highlighted in her presentation, it starts, you can work from legacy systems and build your way up to creating something that's more integrated, interoperable, that there is a pathway to going from cupcakes to a wedding cake, right? And often that starts with questions of what is it that the government is doing? What are some core public functions? What is the extractable value? What is the data that already exists in these legacy systems? And then starting to organize registries, right? And assigning custodianship and saying, okay, how do you think about which registry sits with who, going back to Shrikant's question of like how centralized versus federated would this architecture be and what the API access roadmap would look like. Now, this is the piece that I want to talk about and focus on the most, which is also politically the most complicated, is unbundling delivery from data. This is where, and even as we're thinking about sort of Andhra Pradesh as an example or experiences in other states, one of the biggest challenges is not technology challenge, it's a political challenge, right? Because fundamentally, we're saying there is only one farmer registry, right? There's only one land registry, right? Or there's only one. So you're integrating registries and you're assigning custodianship, and data is power. And today, when a department, for example, of a water utility, a particular sanitation department's been providing that service, they've collected data to provide that service. Now, getting that particular department, or in the context of agriculture, getting the animal husbandry department to relegate rights on certain parts of the data ecosystem that they've managed and owned into a centralized system, I think the trade-off between how much of this is attractive because it's easing administrative burden and making it easier for government to do what they do on a day-to-day basis versus how much of it is a relegation of power becomes sort of a critical question. And as someone who's just worked in the water sector, sorry, I couldn't avoid the temptation of using the pipes analogy, which is we could build the technical infrastructure and the technology infrastructure and think about data standards and build registries. But the trust infrastructure piece is tricky. And one of the things that I think is really fascinating to learn about from several folks here on the call, which I'm hoping we'll cover in the discussion, is what has helped navigate that political economy aspect of trust and where have we managed to see success. But thank you, Mike, over to you.
No, thanks so much, Deepa. Really appreciate it. And yeah, you've captured really eloquently the learning that we've been kind of rapidly undertaking in the AP ecosystem. And I'm really excited to kind of dive into the kind of experiences of folks on the line and similar or different. And like Muni, I know you're on the line and would love to hear some comparative thoughts on what's been going on in Maharashtra. Obviously, Shrikant, your perspective there as well. Time once again for maybe one quick question, and then I'll hand it over to David and Shuko, and with aim for us to wrap all of this up by 11:15 Eastern and get into just the open conversation for the last 45 minutes. So any question for Deepa before we transition on?
I think I have more questions than answers myself, but yeah, happy to.
Yeah, fair enough. Shrikant,
No,
go
just
ahead.
one comment from my side, right? So you talked about registries evolving from, a bunch of other flows that you had on your chart. Registries fundamentally need to be very simple and very rudimentary, right? The idea behind registries is all it does is tells you who you are, what you grow, and where you are. That's pretty much what a registry needs to be. That's for understanding who the user of the system is. So I've seen a lot of places where registries are built with a lot of bells and whistles around this basic content. I don't think that should be the case. I think registries need to be simple. It's almost like what we have with Aadhaar, right? Am I an Aadhaar recipient or not? That's pretty much it. So registries need to be very rudimentary, and I think that's where I think I've seen just myself. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And I love that. And so I'm going to just hand over the reins, David and Shuko, to you both. I'll start sharing my screen again here. And over to you, David.
All right. Well, thank you. And thanks to the earlier presentations to set the stage up nicely for this conversation, which really will dive a little bit more into the policy framework, which creates that enabling environment. And the political economy that you raised, Deepa, very important. It's a slash of both art and science and connections, I believe. So what we want to do is draw on those great examples from India, which over the last decade has seen tremendous advances in the whole digital infrastructure space and its now application into AI services. And think about how we can draw from those lessons and apply them to the African context. And really, in the case of these technologies, it's an amplified version of earlier technologies, which always face this death valley of adoption. You a research organization or development group would develop a product or service, it would maybe reach 10,000, maybe even 100,000 people. But taking it to 1 million people, 10 million people, this is where things really collapse. And I think the points that you raised, Deepa, are critical to transitioning and going across that death valley of adoption. And DPI is going to be very important for us to unlock the power of AI, because without that, AI just can't move. It's like it's the Internet 2.0. Without that infrastructure of the Internet, we weren't able to really collaborate globally. Well, the same is true here. Without that digital public infrastructure, which is both the pipes, as you mentioned, Deepa, physical infrastructure, but also the data element that was brought up earlier, critically important. So the next slide, Mike. So in the case of, I'm a little bit biased, but because I have an agriculture background, I had a lot more examples around agriculture, but we took them out for the sake of time. But really, for transforming African agriculture, it's going to require a real focus on thinking differently around digital public infrastructure. I think in Africa, governments, yes, will play a very important role, but I actually think the telcos are going to play a very significant role given the infrastructure demands of AI and the role that telcos are going to play. Already we saw the leapfrog of mobile money, for example, in Africa. I think a similar kind of transition could happen in the case of AI. So we know that AI through advisory services, especially when they're weather enabled, can increase farm productivity by 10 to 40%. Kenya's been a real pioneer in that with, again, a telco example, Safaricom, as the back end to support the delivery of those services. And it's important to think about agriculture in Africa in a slightly different context than India, although a lot of livelihoods are generated from agriculture in Asia, even more so is the case in Africa. And yet we've got this digital divide 2.0 emerging in the case of AI, given the lack of server farms, et cetera, on the continent. So what we really have to think about, and it was already brought up around the data silos, is how do we sort of do this transition of very siloed infrastructure, siloed data, in order to unlock the power of AI, which everyone agrees, it really needs to be driven on high quality data. And so how do we get there is a question mark. But even with the data in place, without the absence of those rails for the delivery of those services, we just won't be able to advance and scale this and get over the death valley of large scale adoption. Next, please. So already we're seeing a high percentage of AI failure for a variety of reasons. Infrastructure obviously is a really important component to this. Fragmented and low quality data is sort of an entry point for a lot of our work in the ag sector in particular. But I think an important point that hasn't been raised enough is around the digital literacy to unlock the value of AI. And I think there's a huge need here as we think about policies, is how do we incentivize AI education at multiple levels, including in the school system. And so I think that's really going to be important for long-term unlocking of the value of AI. And so it's not seen as a threat to jobs, but actually a key enabler of the modern job across emerging markets. Next slide. So one of the challenges we face, especially in Africa, is around high quality data for training. It's been repeated many times that garbage in, garbage out. Clearly, we need high quality data, and that's improving, but it's still scarce, especially for minor languages. Now, the frontier models are getting better and better at handling minor languages and delivering of AI-enabled advisory services. But there's still a need for high quality, localized training data to deliver quality services. And the other issue too is around latency. In a normal conversation, we would have a 2-second latency before we sort of tune out. in our ADD society here, but currently the lag in Africa is around 8 seconds. And that's just too slow to keep a farmer engaged in that AI-enabled service. So that's an issue that, you know, the physical pipes need to address, and the telcos have a large role to play in that. The next. So investing in both vertical and horizontal. When we talk about verticals, it's really, if in your terminology, deep of the use case to drive the development design of these services, looking at priority needs, where's the low-hanging fruit to deliver maximum value, that then sort of primes the pump for further investment, design, and execution of these services. But the foundation level, those rails, is really important, and this enables what we were talking earlier around interoperability and delivery of targeted services to support a wide range of sectors, from advisory, ag advisory, all the way through to market integration and other financial services that are important for rural consumers. Next, please. This is a topic that our group, AgXAI, has been working on, along with several other topics, but this whole issue of data quality, having a corpus that can actually not just train, but also fine tune and validate model performance is very important. And where we have an absence of data, it's interesting how a workaround is around synthetic data, but here too, we have to be very cautious around what goes into the design and development of synthetic data to fill in those gaps. One of the challenges that is being addressed now is around weather data. Unlike India, the weather data in Africa or across the continent of Africa is rather heterogeneous and generally of low quality, in part because there's so few ground stations for doing the training of models. But that too is improving with time, and Google has made some big advances on that front, along with Tomorrow.io. The next slide, please. So governance, as you were saying, Deep, needs to be at the forefront of how we execute and design. And clearly, these are around sort of three major pillars around ethical principles, like, the FAIR principles of data sharing, but how do we ensure, privacy, transparency, and accountability of these systems? As you said, Deepa, too, start with the end in mind and what are the priority constraints. So taking a user-centered design in the development and co-design of these systems so that farmers feel like they've had agency in the design and delivery of the services that empower them. And then the risk management. This is a brave frontier, AI. The guardrails for its responsible use are weak or sometimes not in place. And so how do we monitor that use to make sure that we're, not infringing on human rights or leading to nefarious use of these services, so that would then betray the trust and set back its deployment, many years potentially. And so I think, when we talk about, India, obviously we have the federal government there. India is like a series of countries, really. They're so large, each state. And in Africa, we have the African Union, and that can maybe serve as a body then to help consolidate some of these governance issues that are going to be relevant to all countries across Africa. So the next slide. So out of all of this, this is not an exhaustive list, but critical success factors to bridge this death valley of pilots and really taking this to large scale. DPI clearly is a foundation that's needed. We can draw a lot of examples from India around Aadhaar and adjacent services that enable that registry to be unlocked and to deliver value to a wide range of consumers. Policy clarity. Some countries do have a national policy on AI, but when we look into those policies in Africa, they really lack the teeth for implementation. And I think we can draw a lot of lessons again from India and the progress it's made, as well as the failures that have been made. Institutional capacity, again, building the human capacity and institutional capacity for sustained use and development on continent is very important. At the AI Summit in Rwanda last year, a resounding voice was said that Africa wants to develop its own AI infrastructure and take agency in this, and not just inherit things that are coming from North America, Europe, or elsewhere. Aligning investment. I think this is where we get into the public-private partnerships here, where governments need to make foundational investments in infrastructure, but alongside with especially the telcos and financial institutions. The African governments just don't have the financial resources to do all of the heavy lifting on infrastructure. There does need to be private sector co-investment in those. Localization. Africa has a wealth of languages, local languages, but they're underrepresented in the data that's used to train these models. Also, as we think about this, think about a gender perspective and also a youth perspective too, as the youth will be really the engines for designing, developing, and delivering these services to the continent. Multi-level capacity, so bringing everyone along with us on this journey, I think, is important, so that it's not just the people like us on this call, but we have the policymakers, we have community representation as we design, develop, and deliver these services. And then coordination. I think I'm a big believer in national level strategies where we go beyond just a strategy and really develop implementation plans that are co-developed with the public and private sector and collaborating. I found that this is where we made big progress in India 10 years ago around an agriculture transformation. And I think there's a lot of lessons that can be adapted and applied to the African context. Shuko, I'd like to hand over to you because DevAfrique is already moving in this direction around Policy Vault and other engagements with national partners that are very relevant. Over to you.
Thanks, David. And I think a lot of the conversation, honestly, has been very exciting, and we've touched on all the significant pieces. I know, when we talk about policies and all the other elements, we cover a lot of infrastructure. We discuss issues around error propagation, standards. We talk about, data qualities, and then now there are all these resounding questions around: should we be rethinking legacy data quality assessments in the wake of DPI and AI? Should we be thinking of, different dimensions? Does it make sense to have a private entity, run DPI? Should it be, government centric? And all of these different conversations. But I think I just wanted to hone a little bit from a different lens, right? In that when we look at the digital transformation, we're trying to move from legacy siloed data to at least the edge of automation. But there are these different layers in between, and this, touches a bit on what Wanjiku had asked earlier. And it's about how do we actually push from where we actually are right now, especially in the context of Africa. And a classic example is we have worked in Nigeria and DRC around geospatial data as well, where we did a very extensive value pipeline assessment to sort of understand the ecosystem. One of the fundamental gaps that is a major bottleneck is, even at the policy level, is the mandate rivalry that actually happens even within government structures. So who owns the mandate to run what? And I think that's the earlier on and first bottleneck. And that sort of halts any other progress that you would make. So a classic example in Nigeria, where they wanted to build a sort of geospatial data clearing house that is interoperable to address all the gaps that comes with siloed data, but at the same time centralized data, because because we know that some of the key issues around centralized data is data sovereignty and other government agencies, partners feeling they are losing their value addition by handing over data to this central entity. And then beyond that is that you create a lot of backlog of work. There's long waiting lines just to have that centralized data access. And so they wanted to create a clearinghouse that does not really, it's not a central repository, but it's just a centralized point for the interconnected digital pathways for geospatial data. But the bottleneck that we had faced and encountered there was, then who owns that particular clearinghouse? Because policy had different institutions and entities with different mandates, and so everyone had was claiming ownership over that. And DPI, you spoke about WASH. That's another very classic case in the WASH sector, right? Like, who owns the right to what? And I think this forms a very key foundational gap in actualizing DPI and ultimately, AI within the continent beyond the technical and infrastructure context that we have. So fortunate for Nigeria, they have a ministry that is responsible for managing conflicts like that, and so it was very easy to reach out to the minister and have the minister sort of bring the different agencies and have them agree and ultimately think about, how do we then push this to become an act? Which institution owns the right? Which one coordinates all the others? And we are in a very good spot in Nigeria, and they're actually developing an act of parliament around that particular component, just so that the agencies involved could manage that right. So having that level of involvement and policy level engagement helps create a very strong pathway for even private sector, because that new entity then has the ability to develop policies that also ultimately create an enabling regulatory environment for even private sector to jump on board in the wake of DPI AI. And a classic example, again, borrowing from Deepa's work in Lusaka, where we're seeing, even as, and this is Zambia particularly, where we're seeing in the water sector, the utility, the ministry, the municipal actually have a coordinated meetings and a coordinated body where they actually even discuss each other's systems and system upgrades. So for example, while we're working with a utility, the municipal and the Ministry of Health were sitting on the utilities technical advisory board. And what that created was they are able to create from the design and system specification stage, the interoperable components that allow Ministry of Health to access, sanitation data and some level of water data from the commercial utility, and allow the municipality as well to access that data in a bid to have that one central hub. So even at that micro level, it then creates a very strong use case that could cascade to the national level. And now we're seeing, a lot of conversations even at the national level around one government where all ministries have, sort of an interoperable system that pulls data from all places. So just to say, that even as we think about the broader, infrastructure, the error propagations, the standards, and all these other components, super important to also look at the actual vehicles on the ground that drive these particular engagements in the wake of, how do we address these mandate rivalries from a policy lens. Mike,
Amazing.
I see you are.
I am pseudo politely nudging my way in. That's right. No, I mean that's a perfect wrap up, Shuko. And I will first and foremost, if anyone has a kind of quick question for David or Shuko, I'd love to, at least one question specifically on that. And then really just looking forward, I mean, I think this whole discussion has really set this real concrete texture on this journey from these, how building out the data foundations, testing and learning about how use case identification, testing and learning to enable scale, and the role and essential role that policy and the kind of political economic context in which you're operating play, and kind of tying into those levers and realities to all along the way to make sure you're taking the right steps in the right way at the right time. So I'm really so I am anxious to get to the broader group conversation, but please, if any questions specifically for David or Shuka, let's start with that.
I have a quick question for David. David, you said something that really resonated about sort of the failure rate of pilots, and 80% of them, 90% of them failing. And in your experience, can you think of a few things that perhaps led the other 10 to 15% to actually succeed?
Yeah, I think, and Deepa has also pointed this out in her presentation. I mean, start with the end in mind and understanding what is the real problem that's being solved. Second is building sort of the North Star alignment across actors, especially the government, on a path to solving that. And then look at the elements you need to, your roadmap to solve it, and the partnerships. I think quite often we look at new technology as a shining object and want to play with it, but we actually aren't really focusing on what is the primary problem that we're trying to address. So, I mean, I know that's overly simplified, but I mean,
you've solved it, David. We're good now.
No, yeah, well, and I think that's the other thing too, that it's an iterative process. You'll go through and do a first pass, and you'll find this, I'm sure, in your AP implementation. And so being agile is really important. And then I think the one on sort of an anthropology level is being very humble. I think that goes a long way.
Amazing. So I'm gonna now officially just open the doors, and I want this conversation to flow where it flows. I think I'll go back. I'll stop sharing my screen in a moment, but just to well, this is gonna take forever if I go all the way back through all the slides. Just to reset kind of these objectives. What, as you were listening through this, hearing these different kind of steps along this journey extrapolated out, and kind of the shared experiences and learnings that we shared from our organizations, I just come back to especially number 2 and 3, and I'd love to hear from people that are working on other issues. What are you working on right now? What resonated from what was shared? What are different experiences or challenges that you're confronting? Different perspectives that you have that might contrast with some of the way we framed this process and journey. So the floor is open, and I'll just create some space. Please, it's Shashi. Yeah.
So Michael, I can three points. There are 3 points that I actually noted down.
Sure.
Sorry, was it me? Somebody else? Yeah, I think somebody's got it. Yeah.
All right. You go. Continue, Srikanth, and then Shashi, you'll go next.
Okay. There are 3 points that I actually noted down. One was around the exclusion of smallhold farmers in terms of the digital economy, or the improvement that they can actually get right. I think the fundamental solution to the problem is voice. That there are delays in terms of voice end-to-end cycles and things like that. But I think we've actually done this in Maharashtra, where we've got about complete voice enablement in a couple of districts, and we're seeing excellent results. And it's not necessarily that people need to be literate. They can actually use something in their own language. There was a remote language called Billy that we've created a model for in order to enable this. So that's the effort that's currently underway. So we're trying to make sure that voice kind of removes that divide that potentially can exist. That's one part. The second one I had was you absolutely need to have sovereign models. Data flowing across to the large players is not going to be acceptable in most parts of the world in the current context, in the political climate that we are living in currently. The third one was more of a question. I heard a lot of things about DPI. DPI to me is about something that is packaged and redeployable elsewhere. I'm not seeing that in the terminology of DPI that I've seen in the presentations. Maybe somebody can answer that. But those were the 3 points that I had.
Sorry, could you restate that last one? I want to make sure I got the question right.
So there's a lot of references to DPI. There were a lot of references to DPI, but DPI only in the context of payments and ID is what I saw. For me, it's DPI or content. It should just allow people to essentially bring their content into some framework that allows it to be distributed. And I think that I didn't see, so maybe I got it wrong, but I just wanted to bring that out. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm not going to respond to those points directly. I want to yet. I mean, I think the sovereign models one is a super interesting and important conversation that let's return to if there's time. I think that in and of itself could be a 2-hour session. So I don't want to yet open that can of worms. And then I think on the DPI, my hunch is some of that discussion will come out as we go. So I don't want to.
I can just take a
sure if you want to do a quick response on that.
I'll just take 10 seconds, Shrikant, and if sort of just going back to the AP sort of experience, right? The idea is anybody can build DPGs, right? Once the data foundations are set, you can build any number of applications as long as it subscribes. And when you sort of went in that section on how do you unbundle data from delivery, and I think that's just in a way for me, the DPGs sit on the delivery side and have to be reusable and redeployable so that there's just they build on some of that modular architecture vision. But you're right. I think I don't think it's explicit, but that's definitely in there. And there could also be folks that can work. There could be creative PPPs where there's revenue models built out of it too, right? So there are lots of possibilities, but as long as they're aligned with some of the core tenets of how you build DPGs.
Yeah, and I think it aligns. I mean, I think it aligns with what Beverly said, right? As far as like the model of governance that works in a given country context is going to inform kind of the setup and structure of some of these, these DPGs and where they sit within those constructs and potentially PPP models, potentially fully government owned. And there's been amazing, a lot of really valid and challenges that have been shared in the conversation or the presentation so far already around these data sharing challenges, right? Which is something that we've been exploring quite a lot in our data corpus kind of working group in the AgXAI program as well. This is really emerging as a real kind of foundational challenge that I think gets glossed over like at a funding level maybe, and at the end of the day is really a big part of where the rubber meets the road from I think what everyone's shared so far. So getting that structurally right and consistent and aligned with the contextual realities across these different sectors and government and governance arrangements, it's easy to talk about. It's very hard to do. And I think that's really a big crux of what we're trying to tackle here. Go ahead, Shachi.
Thanks, Mike. And thank you for having me. And it was wonderful to hear everybody's experiences. It's always so much richer to hear exactly the challenges people are facing on the ground. I just wanted to kind of related to the previous comment, just ask all the speakers if they have any insights on the enabling conditions, especially in governments, that can encourage this kind of data sharing. I know we've alluded to the capacity building, right? Like just awareness, understanding can help. And then there are these silos and data quality issues that we're trying to tackle. But I think that there's this other beast in the back, perhaps, and check me if I'm wrong here, but there's the political economy bit, right? Like in many places, there isn't really like a dedicated entity that is thinking about this kind of stuff all the time. Like we're still working, our structural systems are still set up in the quote unquote old ways, even as we try to adopt AI, right? And so it's like, if the data is sitting with ministry X, I mean, the data we would need sits across like 4 different ministries, and then each one is just, forget the technical aspects, just wondering like whose responsibility is this? How do we incentivize like openness between ministries or even within a ministry sometimes? I feel like that's where things get tricky. And I'm just wondering if you have any insights about that kind of capacity building within governments that are used to working in a certain way. And that's a very hard sort of behavioral change shift, which is not related to the AI bit at all, right? It's just kind of related to how do we work with each other better in this new world which requires us to do so. One thing that like I think we've tried to explore is building communities of practice, stewardships, where there's just better exchange, conversation between organizations within that we think would be champions for a particular use case. But yeah, I mean that's just one thought. But I'm just curious from these implementation exercises if there have been any rich learnings about how legacy systems can continue to innovate within the existing structures that they live in. Over.
I have my own thoughts. David, you raised your hand while Shashi was talking. Was that to respond to her question? I'm thinking if you're responding to someone's comment, I'm going to actually ask you to raise your physical hand so as not to confuse the queue of people that want to go. So David, please go ahead and respond.
So just short.
Next.
My experience when I was in India working with state and federal governments was like with Chief Minister Naidu, for example. He actually set up a smaller group, almost like an internal consulting group within the government structure, to actually herd the different ministries and get them aligned towards an implementation that had a dashboard to create accountability for implementation. I'm not saying that is going to work for everybody, but that seemed to work in that case.
Go ahead, Bev, and then I'm going to jump in with my own quick thought, and then Kankanika, you'll be next in the queue if you.
I think this is an important one. And early on, I'd mentioned briefly about decision making. I think it's getting really specific about what we mean. What decisions are we mapping? Where I feel like we've had success or ongoing inroads, especially around sustainability, i.e. thinking about how these new data sharing structures, et cetera, continue after our programs are over, is connecting it to real work that people are doing. It's going to be easier to make the incentive if this actually actively helps them do the work they are already expected to do because of a strategy, because of leadership requirements, because of something else. So what we spend a lot of time doing is really making sure that we mapped and understood. These are the key decisions that the minister is making, that the state minister is making, that the directors and owners of the systems are needing to make, or the kind of data they need to gather because the higher ups are asking. So I think that mapping takes a lot of time, and sometimes it gets a bad rap because people do the mapping and they stop after that. But it's to keep coming back and connecting the technologies and the system upgrades back to what the need is. And I actually think, thank you, sweetheart. Sorry, my daughter's here. I actually think it's a great framing around AI. It's directly related to AI, because I think if we're thinking about where the successes and the uptake and use are going to come from, we've got to remain anchored in how we're framing and understanding what the problem is, making sure that we're solving an actual problem and not just making one up.
That's great. Yeah. And just quickly from my perspective, and I mean, Shashi, your comment in the chat is more or less, I do think the leadership piece, right, and alignment with leadership objectives is essential. Now, can you sway leadership to organize around this? Potentially. But if you have a leader that is aligned with this vision from the get-go, I mean, as an enabling condition, that's huge and perhaps just fundamentally essential. And then when you get that leadership drive, then you get into these brass tacks like Bev is just describing, of like how you're really aligning your actions and with these kind of decision making elements across the different component aspects of the context. And you're also thinking through the specifics of these data sharing agreements and realities and governance, etc., under that hood of an aligned leader. So yeah. And then, sorry. Oh, Mooney, can I call you out based on Deepa's comment to respond to this if you're still on the line? he may I don't know if he dropped off. Okay, we'll just keep it move. Oh no, he is there, but that's fine. Kanganika, why don't you go with, I know you had your hand raised, and then Dolapo. Oh,
I also put my hand down because Sashi actually asked what I was looking for. We are currently working on building a water data exchange in India. This will be a decentralized interoperable network of different participants, data providers and data applications. We are just beginning our journey, and we have not yet, interfaced with the government or policy. We are taking that approach. Okay, so this is Satva Consulting along with our partners. ITC is seed funding the first use case for us. We have other organizations like INREM, Beacon, FIDE, who has worked on the UPI, Aadhaar, etc., and GeoWhale and CoreStack. So it's a lot of us, we are a collaborative. That's what I wanted to ask essentially this is a water data exchange. Therefore, we're talking about water, which Sashim actually mentioned it. It becomes very complicated when it comes to water. Different government organizations are holding data. It's in different formats, PDFs to geospatial data. So bringing it all together is something that we are trying to do already, but interfacing with the government is something that we have kept aside. So it was really good to hear all the three presentations actually talk about, the importance of doing it. I would like to hear if you have any experience around the water sector, and Deepa, you also mentioned already about it, but at what level should we start engaging? Would NITI be the best option to start talking about a water data exchange or any DPI that we are working on, or is it the state level? So as we move forward, I would just like to hear from experience, because already I learned a lot from all the presentations. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kanganika. It's very exciting. I'd love to learn more. In all honesty, I think there is a lot of, in fact, the acronym DPI itself, for me, introduces a new level of, I need to start let me put it this way. I struggle with these terms, right? And I'll kind of try and break it down and talk about it at a very sort of brass tacks level, which is, we know that there is a lot of redundancy and inefficiency, right, in how we administrate and run operations, whether it's a water utility or national government that makes policies. In fact, one of the things, my first questions is, as you were speaking, what is this data exchange for, right? In the work that we've done in the water and sanitation sector, often it's government, right? It's a national or a state level government agency, which is the custodian and the initiator. There's some really interesting work that's happened in the state government of Odisha, where they've really and what's fascinating is because water sits within urban services. So it doesn't make sense to even look at water as a standalone thing, but to think about it in a more integrated way with municipal functions. So what they've done is really built out that entire foundational architecture on assets, finances, customers, and thinking about like going back to what Shrikant said, what are the data registries one needs to build? how do you then, going back to some of the same principles, and Digit is doing this as part of IGA Foundation. And I think they've done some incredible work in terms of then building a bunch of services, right? And apps and citizen-facing services, from taxes to grievances, to being able to actually, run a lot of their call center operations, including call for like an emptying operator and things like that. Because of the intentionality in how they're thinking about those fundamental registries, right, on assets, customers, finances, they're starting to create interoperability. So when you say wastewater treatment plant, there's only one way to define it and think about it, and there's only one alphanumeric code that's assigned to that data point, right? So the data exchange, in a way, is a sort of a positive byproduct of that intentional design. But I mean, yeah, I have lots of questions about sort of what this is, and happy to engage more, but that's just sharing an anecdote of what's working in Odisha.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay, real quick, go ahead, Kanganika, and then I was gonna
No,
Shuko
I-
let you respond on the previous one, and then we'll go to Dolapo.
We are taking a very use case perspective to this. So we're starting with a use case for farmers. Therefore, farmers are the intended users. But what I hear from what you're saying, Deepa, is probably it'll be good to understand who is that Orisha type of a body, like whether it's in the central government or state government, maybe not necessary, but who has that intentionality to work towards a interoperable network, and that's where we can start. So maybe something like that. So anyway, we'll talk more about water data exchange with you, Deepa. We'll catch up in a separate call. Thank you so much, everyone.
Oh, thank you. Go ahead, Shuko, please.
Thanks, Mike. The previous question, I even lost my train of thought, but I was thinking in the lines of something that we really tried is borrowed from the public health space, right? They previously in health promotion used the shock and horror technique. If you remember back in the days, to stop smokers from smoking, they'll show you what a lung looks like for a person that smokes versus a healthy one. And so similarly for this, right? For governments, just helping them walk through the bottlenecks that they face and encounter, right? So for example, when you look at how the transition works, a lot of siloed data, it then transitions to, this strong push to have centralized data, but centralized data has its own gaps. And then, again, you're back to let's democratize this data, let's ensure everyone has access, etc., right? You bring in this DPI lens, and then consequently you want to get to the automation end. But so helping them weave through these different bottlenecks and gaps and relating that to the work that they actually do is one of the ways that we helped the Nigerian government run away from a centralized repo to more of a clearinghouse, right? For the work that they do. And the clearinghouse is tied to what Deepa was talking about, the data exchange. So this is one other, component and layer that I think Shrikant was talking about for DPI, looking at it from a lens of, not just the IDs and the payments, but also looking at it as a road network that allows data to flow through it in a bid to allow, people to have access to it. And a classic example is the work that the Commonwealth is doing around ag, and they've done there's a lot of reports out there that they've put out recently. They're trying to think about an innovative data exchange model, and they've done studies across different geographies to understand which model would work best. And this data exchange model is where you have a particular entity, not defined, that sort of governs that central data exchange where all the different road networks, if you may think about it that way, lead to in a bid to access this data. Now, who does that data ultimately target is anyone. The World Bank will come, wants to have access to particular data in a country. The government wants access to data, or whatever entity wants to have access to this data. They will send a request to that central agency, and then that central agency triggers within that data exchange platform to those parties that have that data. And what they are adding to it is a layer of income generation. So whoever accesses your data, there's sort of a payment attached to it, just to help incentivize you to keep your data up to date. And beyond that is to ensure that your data is consistently, accurate. So you run away from investing in mega DQA or data quality strengthening initiatives to those particular units of your broader data exchange, managing the data accuracy of their own systems. And so they've published a lot of papers around that. And there's obviously a lot of debates based on country on who should that central exchange entity be. Should it be a private sector? Should it be government? Should it be a central statistical agency, and vice versa? So just wanted to add that layer deep. And I mean, there's a lot of papers that I could also share from that work, but mostly it's within the ag space that they're trying to pilot that and see how it cascades to other sectors.
Super interesting, Shuko, and I have some follow-up thoughts and questions for you beyond that, but I want to let other people chime in. So Dolapo, over to you. You've been very patient here.
Thanks, Mike. I've been learning quite a lot, so this has really been fantastic for me. So for a little context, I'm working on a project in Nigeria that AI-enabled agricultural extension platform, but delivered through a PPP. Now, within this project, we have a private sector organization as the long-term product owner. And obviously, there are concerns about that. I think the way Gates Foundation has structured it is, they're trying out different models in different countries. And as Bev mentioned, there are different nuances in each country that would warrant different things. But, from the perspective of, I think sustainability was a big, consideration because with a lot of government projects in Nigeria, continuity was always a problem, when moving from sort of one government to another. And so trying to ensure that, maybe that's not the case, we're essentially trying a private sector-led model. And so, I think there's a lot that everyone has said, and I'm hoping there's going to be a playback to this because there's different things I'm thinking of, but I don't know, does anyone here maybe have experiences around that where, you actually have a private sector organization that's building that infrastructure, will be hosting. I know, vendor lock-in is, a major risk, but I'm really looking to learn really and see what we can be looking at in this project. We're currently in the planning phase, and we'll be moving into sort of design and implementation post-March. And so I'm really just looking for learnings, experiences. And I think a lot of what Shuko has said, a lot of what Bev has said, and even a lot of other people is quite relevant. So I probably will be reaching out bilaterally as well. But just wanted to put that comment out there and for any reactions, comments, and guidance. Thanks.
Go ahead, Bev.
Thanks, Dolapo, for that. And I'm glad that you brought it up because I was so glad that Deepa flagged on vendor lock-in because it's something that I really wanted to address. So thank you for giving me the perfect excuse to get into it. I think that we strive really hard at Development Gateway to be tool agnostic. Okay. School is closed for the third day in a row. So we will do multiple things at once. We will talk about vendor lock-in and we will also do an art project on the side. So I need a second. So the most important thing to highlight here is that we're tool agnostic and the private sector can be an extremely important player. One of the ways that we can bridge sometimes some of those gaps is really about information exchange and sharing. When we came in, one of the 5 systems we worked with had been built by a private sector partner. Not a bad thing. Where we had an issue was a lack of documentation. We didn't have access to the code, the underlying code. We didn't have access to the operational manuals. These are the kinds of things that no matter who builds, whether it's open source or closed, that documentation is essential. So when you're thinking about, in particular, Dolapo, setting up structures that involve private sector leading on the development of infrastructure, just really be thinking about that future endpoint. Does the government partner or the other civil society partners in place know where they can get that documentation when they need it, so that when upgrades are required, when expansions are required, going back to a question about how do we know what happens, how do we build for AI in the future, that I think Betsy had asked early on. That's one of the ways that we do that, is the documentation piece. So vendor lock-in doesn't have to be a death knell if we're thinking ahead to what kinds of information that can be gathered from the vendor during the time of service, so that handoff is possible.
Fantastic. Or go ahead, Deepa, were you gonna weigh in? Sorry, you're on mute.
No, I just no. I just think this is so and even with all of the right intention, even when the government's on top of it with the highest level of skill, there are massive risks, right? Like we've struggled when the private sector has built stuff with all of it, Shrikant, like it'll be great to hear sort of what your experience is, but and often these are system integrators, right? Like they're not coming in to do one software, they're coming in to really kind of look at a lot of different data systems. And that's kind of why I talked about system integrator lock-ins, right, as a risk that to consider, because there is just no substitute for government capacity to be an effective counterpart, right? And which means have some sort of staffing norms, no amount of or sort of front public sector capacity, or somebody guaranteeing that capacity as a counterpart for a while till that's being built, and sort of really being a custodian of the government's interest, which we see in PPPs all the time, right? You'll have a project management, committee or a partner working for the government's interest on bidding criteria and viability gap design, while then so you almost think of it as the equivalent. In my head, I think of it as a concessioning authority, but in this case, somebody who's defending government's interest, because we could talk about, we've seen this where they say, oh, the data is yours, but it's really not, because the government has no way of actually doing what the private sector does so seamlessly because of just the way it's set up and built. And in a low capacity environment, actually everything goes in reverse. And I've seen this in some of the states that we worked in the water sector, but again, I'm sure there are folks who've done this here who can weigh in, but I think definitely if the capacity doesn't exist, have somebody doing that, protecting government interests in that contract from the get-go.
Okay.
So I think, Deepa, just to respond on your thing, I think this vendor agnostic nature of how content needs to flow still needs a governance body in the middle. Who gets, say, like, for example, in Maharashtra, what we've done is we've created the infrastructure, what we've created as a network. So you can have private parties, you can have government entities, you can have educational institutions, research institutions, anybody bringing in data, but the gating criteria is decided by the government. There is an accountable body. It's not randomly any private player bringing in their content to play, but it needs to be vetted by somebody centrally. Otherwise, you're going to have chaos in the system. But at the same time, you need to, it does. And I think that's something that needs to be created potentially by private players to, enforce that within the government, saying that you need to have your own capacity to do this. Unless you make that happen, it's not going to be successful.
But that's also where the leadership bit comes into play, right? What is the leadership organizing around, and what are they prioritizing, right? If leadership has already decided on a different model, can you sway them towards that type of governing model that you're describing that has been put to effect by leadership in Maharashtra, and what do you do in the situations where that doesn't exist, right? So those questions get tricky. But I'm gonna try to keep there's some people that have had their hands raised patiently, and I do want
we should
to keep going.
Praveen, please, I think.
Yeah, Praveen, go ahead. I'm also gonna just quickly, I'm gonna put up a Menti poll just as a screen share, which you can fill in, especially if you have to drop off right at the hour. or the half hour, depending on which time zone you're in. Would love to kind of collect people's thoughts, but we can keep the conversation going a little bit longer for those that can stay. Go ahead, Praveen.
Yeah. So these are great conversations, right? And I've had like multiple inputs on these. So regarding the there is some work that we did with the Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana, right? The PMFEY, the crop insurance programs, and just drawing references from that, like even adding on to Shrikant, there is a central governance body, right? And which there is the aspect of adding multiple partners, so private players. So that does help in many ways because private players do bring in the latest tools and technologies and know how they're able to faster test and deploy and everything, right? Like, so rather than looking at one single vendor, I would actually look at it from a multiple vendor done, the pilots over a period of time before you actually like decide to go with a couple of them, right? But even there, I think it's not a vendor lock-in per se, but there is also the aspect of not only like deploying models, systems and everything. There is also skilling that happens, right? So public systems and bodies need definitely upskilling, not only in terms of technology and know-how, but also in terms of also the current tools that are available, right? So all that has to also be factored in. And I do agree with Bev that like there can be transferability, but at the same time, one has to also look at not only documentation, but how does that know-how, the entire training process is transferred to the next organization which comes in, right? Like, so those are things. I think the Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana is a great example where there is the public-private partnership, governance body, the transferring that has happened, right? And looking at it from a systemic perspective, right? Like with the end goal of providing financial incentives, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is, I think, which I raised is regarding the value itself. I think like one of the big elephant in the room, I would say with respect to many of these DPIs is that wrong insistence given on or incentives given for models and infrastructures are not enough of data, right? Like, and I honestly believe that actually there should be a pivot that's happening on incentivizing data, because I think like now we can almost like anyone can build a model, whether a large scale or a small scale model, and most open source small scale models can actually perform at scale. As much as larger models, right? Like, although many organizations would like us to think that it's the opposite, right? So I think that's a very important piece. And with that, associated with that is how do you design infrastructures that incentivize, like data sharing and having dynamic data, right? Public data. So I think these are, I mean, I have a whole lot of things, but I know that we are running out of time, but happy to take these conversations separately.
Amazing. Thank you, Praveen. And I want to explore further with you and Deepa that comment you made about this power and potential of small language models, and maybe Shuko, we could explore that conversation with you as well, and kind of this untapped potential or not, currently being tapped potential of those small language models. Because I think that's a really, really powerful comment you made, and it ties, Shrikant, to what you were talking about as far as sovereign models as well. And so there's a lot to unpack, I think, from what you were saying there. All right, I'm going to move on to JT. And then Betsy will get to you, and then I will have successfully gotten to all of the raised hands by the end of the session. No, and we have 2 minutes left, so we might go a little bit over, but I'll accept that.
All right, sure. Thanks, Michael. Really great conversations that we're having here. So just a bit of context. So my full name, Joseph Theory, based in Kenya. We are currently implementing AI advisory in Kenya. to be able to reach farmers, to have the knowledge they require, etc. And as part of that, we are also building DPI foundations, but specifically an agri-stack, which sounds very similar to, I think, what was described as the data exchange. But my question actually is related to what I think it was Dolop that asked something similar around the sustainability aspect, because we also do have a PPP kind of arrangement where we are the ones who are actually helping government implement the technical aspects of the DPI. But then I would have loved to hear more about the different business models or incentives that have actually been tried and that are running, and maybe some of the challenges that came up with that. Because we've touched a bit about the incentives, we've talked about capacity, of course, being private sector, of course, has more capacity. And so we know that labor is not cheap, especially when we're talking about AI, we're talking about infrastructure, latest technology. So maybe if anyone has any context on what has been tried, what has failed, what are the challenges or what is currently ongoing, I think that would be great to hear more on.
Please go ahead, Praveen.
I think there was a raised hand before me, but I mean, one of the challenges.
Were you raising your hand to respond to that question, though?
Yeah, I did have one response, maybe for challenges, and I think this is with respect to creating registries. So farmer registry has been quite challenging because it's been a little bit like, there are things that are needed, there are things that, which has already been raised, which you don't need. But I think one critical element is the geo-audited farmland plot boundary, and that's, I think not globally, like there are very few cadastral maps available which are updated. And I think in the global south, that's a big factor, like not having that is one of the biggest challenge to actually providing reliable services, in my opinion. And that's also raises some important concerns, and it's not easy to bring that also to the forefront because it raises the question of privacy and ownership and things like that, right? Like, but at the same time, like not understanding where the farm plots are and what is being grown and what's the yield and output and management practices and everything. Many of the current AI models, both LLMs and geospatial, really fall short of their mark where they have the performance and specificity is concerned, right? So I think that's one of the biggest thing that I've faced working in the data set that's publicly available.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, JT, honestly, part of my reaction was maybe that's like a session unto itself. And I know someone talked about a session to learn from other case studies, but I think that's such an important question that you're raising. And I think the reality is some of this is we're the learners, right? We're the ones literally trying to figure this out in real time right now. With an emerging technology across different contexts. So to the extent that there are, broadly applicable, tested, proven models of success, I think that's a need to continue these types of conversations and information and learning exchanges. And that's kind of part of the hope for this session is like, what are the types of questions like that are broadly applicable across geographies and across sectors that we can kind of think about together, because it's such an important one and it's a really hard one, and there's not a one size fits all answer, right? When we're talking about what are these incentivization models, and I think it connects to everything that we've been talking about throughout this thing, whether you're talking about what is the existing kind of data foundations and whether you're talking about what is the drive and focus and edict from leadership in a given, at a national or subnational level in a given context, and what is the availability or readiness within governance or governments or governance bodies to kind of meaningfully oversee the deployment or development or deployment of kind of these digitalization efforts, whether that's just the interoperable digital infrastructure itself or actual kind of AI tools and solutions. So I wish I had a good answer for you, JT, and happy to be on a discovery journey with you is probably the best I can offer at the moment. Betsy, I'm gonna go to you, and obviously understand if people need to drop off. We're now 5 minutes past time, but you know, happy to continue the conversation for another few minutes here, for those that are able. Go ahead, Betsy, please. And thank you for your patience.
Okay. Thank you. So thank you for the conversations. I think DPI is really hot right now, especially around unlocking the data needed to build public-facing AI applications. But I can't help reflect back on open data. A decade ago, open data was set to revolutionize how especially government data becomes more interoperable, data sharing, and all that. So my question is, in terms of the DPI, right, and thinking back on open data and open governance, what can we learn from the failures of that initiative going forward so that 10 years from now, we are not still talking about making data more interoperable and data sharing. I do appreciate that the DPI sort of takes open data to the next level, whereby you're not just opening up data, but you're actually building things on top of that data that you're trying to exchange and provide the safeguards for more data sharing, equitable data sharing, things around incentives towards data sharing. But what can we learn from this tragedy of the commons that was open data?
Right. Sort of a quick reaction, and I think Srikanth, truly you're the DPI expert, right? Cost has pioneered this, so it'll be great. I think DPI systems can include open data, but it doesn't guarantee openness for everything that's generated, right? Like it becomes a subset. It could become an input. Let's see, but taking a DPI approach in itself doesn't guarantee openness, right? I wouldn't use those synonymously. I don't think open data. Exactly, right? So this is much more. Sorry, Srikanth?
That's correct.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
it doesn't guarantee it's open data. Correct.
So in a way, and that's what it does. It certainly kind of makes it more seamless. It makes data more interoperable. Because of sort of the architecture, there's just more auditable trails. There's improved data quality, but just kind of wanted to clarify that it doesn't really contribute directly into the open, because again, the decision to open data up is a political decision, and it doesn't guarantee that, but it can draw on a lot of open data sets, as it's like we're seeing in ag in terms of open spatial data sets and other factors. But that's just my 2 cents on the linkage with Dev, Srikanth. But Praveen, sorry, go ahead, Praveen, see your hands up.
Yeah, so I think India has obviously decided that they want a lot of this data to be centrally hosted for usage, and of course not PII, but everything else. AI Coast is an example of that, which is intended to be for that purpose. But yeah, it's a decision that needs to be done locality by locality, I guess. Yeah.
Right. Adding on to what
I have some
Srikanth said,
questions directed. Yeah, I just one thing. I have some questions coming up, but I'm not able to type anything on chat. So please reach out to me directly. I can answer those questions. Yeah. I don't know why, but it says chat not available.
Oh, that's do you want to just say them out loud for the transcript, and we'll circle back to them?
Okay, sure. No, I mean, yeah, I'll
So
answer
sorry,
those
but
separately. No worries. Yeah. No problem.
Okay. Go ahead, Praveen.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and in the public domain, also in the scientific space, this is often debated, right? Like many of the so-called large players who claim open source is not really open because they have only declared like open weights. but not, I've just put that in the chat as well, but happy to read that. So they don't give understanding of how they've trained the models, what kind of infrastructure they've used, what is the data set that they're drawing it from. And obviously private players have no incentive for doing that, right? Like, and largely the open source systems have been coming from public universities, academic institutions and everything, where there is a funding mechanism to support that system, right? And but we do know for a fact that that the competitive models lies within some of these enterprise level organizations, right? Like, because they have managed to push the boundaries somehow, and unfortunately they are not yet open source, right? Like, and so that I just want to make the distinction that there is open and open. So some of it really claim as open, but it's not really open in the true sense, right? Like, and
Absolutely. No, thank you for bringing, your ability to kind of talk about some of the nuance under the hood is greatly appreciated on that point, Praveen. I'm going to have us stop there. We're 10 minutes kind of past the planned end time. I just want to thank this group once again for kind of joining us. I of course want to thank Development Gateway, DevAfrique, DevGlobal for joining Athena Infonomics and presenting this India AI Summit pre-summit event. But truly, thank you all for joining. This was very genuinely exactly what I hoped it would be. It was an extremely rich conversation, and the insights, perspectives, applied kind of work that everyone in this conversation is doing is so interesting. And I think we're all tackling such similar challenges across different contexts. And there's so much opportunity to keep learning from each other and with each other as we kind of advance and try to help our collaborating partners, whether that's a funding entity or a government at a national or subnational level, kind of advance on this journey from data foundation to solutions that scale, sustain, and drive positive impact. So really appreciate everyone's time and participation, and we will share. As David rightly pointed out, we'll share the slides from this. We'll share some kind of key takeaways and maybe some suggested next steps or actions. So be on the lookout for those. And thank you once again. Have a great evening, afternoon. I don't think there's anyone for whom it's still morning, but have a great rest of your days wherever you are.
Thank you.